there are only two father and son ambassadorial teams to the same missions in American history, and the other is John and John Quincy Adams to The Hague and to London. So, Ron Neumann, congratulations.
Thank you, Nick, for that setup, for that introduction. No, I think that given the tenor of the most recent comments, I'm going to be something of a contrarian here. Although I am quick to point out that I am retired, I do not speak for the US government, and there are plenty of examples of things in my own book that I think we got wrong, didn't do, including the fact that I made a very large attempt late in 2005 to get what seems now laughably small, a $600 million economic supplemental for 2006, which would in fact have worked on agriculture and infrastructure and some of these things, and I got 43 at the end of the process. So I'm not here as a defender of current or past policy per se, but I'm here to express my own views. In short, what I'm going to argue is that there are more possibilities than some of my colleagues have noted, that execution is in fact now the central issue and not the policy itself, that there is somewhat more time than I believe many assert, not a lot more time, but a bit more, and that it is in fact worth the effort to persevere. Now, I do have, as you might begin to suspect, some pretty strong differences of view with Paul, albeit a lot of respect for many of the things he said, and perhaps closer on some of the endpoints, some of the issues of what comes next or what do you do about it. I don't want to spend the speech particularly on that because I want to talk about a level of detail that we do not frequently address, but which I think is critical in understanding the situation. So I will just note for the record now that I think, with all respect, that you greatly underestimate the effect in Pakistan and on Pakistani policy if we are on the way out of Afghanistan. And I do think that al-Qaeda's announced goals, which are, you can say, I suppose, that it is similar to the Vietnam situation, in which I would note that I also fought as an infantry officer. But they have an announced expansionist goal. We are not the primary target. We simply happen to be in the way. But it is, I think, useful to remember that they refer to, while we talk about New York as terrorism, they refer to it as the raid on New York. That is an important distinction. That is a part of a war. They regard it as a continuing part. It tends to be more a starting part for Americans because we weren't paying attention. But nevertheless, that has, from their point of view, a real aspect of a war. And there are, I don't know of any historical examples of one side deciding to unilaterally withdraw from a war that the other side doesn't say is over, and doing well in that. But I'm going to leave that because I want to talk about a couple of other things. I agree that the rather gloomy scenario that my good friend Whitney put out is possible. But I do not think it is certain. And while many have repeated that there is no military victory or solution, I think, and I agree with that, but I think it is also very useful to point out the corollary that there is absolutely and certainly military defeat. We have a tendency to move sort of lightning fashion from the enunciation of some correct principles to a view of this means you have to do this, that, or the other thing without really discussing I think, as much as one should, whether the this, that, or the other thing is possible, likely, or how you can implement it. Whitney and Ahmed Rashid both spoke not only of the need for a political solution, but they spoke of a key, essential element in such a political solution from our point of view, from the Pakistani point of view, which is that the Taliban separate from Al-Qaeda. I simply note that that has not happened. There is now, as of now, there is no indication that it will happen. There are reasons to argue that it could happen, which is another debate we should have, but not in the 24 minutes and 34 seconds left. But those indications are hope. And as my military colleagues used to remind me, hope is not a plan. I cannot see a lot of reason to pursue a strategy based on having a decent interval. Because we're talking about a strategy in which we're committing American lives and a great deal of money, but particularly lives. A strategy of having simply a decent interval, a withdrawal with apparent honor to conceal what is a defeat, seems to me an enormous waste of American idealism, American lives, and American treasure. I do not think it is morally defensible. You're either engaged for a larger purpose or you admit defeat. Now, if you admit defeat, you can conceal it, that's a different story. But as a strategic goal of itself, decent interval is, in my mind, not a goal. It may be a tactic, but it is not a goal. I think the risks are great, but I think it is too early for despair. So I want to talk a little about what the current policy is and some thoughts on what to look at and analyze, even if you don't agree with my conclusions at all. Now, there is a goal which has been laid out that underlies both the anti-terrorism goal and some of the specific points that Dr. Goodson very correctly put out. And that was stated particularly clearly in General McChrystal's report, and I think it is there in the President's comments. And it is basically that one looks to have an Afghan government with enough popular support that it can sustain whatever struggle there is for a considerable period, probably with foreign economic support, but without dependence on foreign troops. A sort of sustainability strategy, as I think General Petraeus has called it. That is a clear goal. It may not be attainable. We haven't had so much of it discussion in this class time, but we have done it in many other forums where people say there's no clear goal. No, there is a clear goal now. I don't think there was much of one before. The question is whether it is attainable, not whether it exists. From that goal, there is a policy which has been laid out. But let me remind you of the key pieces of that policy, which I would argue is about the best we can do right now. It is to secure the population. That is one of the largest conceptual changes in the Obama administration. And it is absolutely true that it's really extremely difficult to get people to do anything else if you can't keep them alive. There is a logic that flows from that if you're going to protect, if Afghan civilians are going to be protected, they have to be protected by Afghan forces because they know that the foreigners always leave. And besides that, the foreigners are never going to understand the issues involved in local protection in the way that is ultimately necessary. That drives a logic of creating a larger army. And that logic tells you that that's not going to happen overnight, and that therefore you are going to have somewhat larger foreign forces for a while. There is a goal of moving the government forward, which is probably the hardest part, and I want to come back to talking about that. But those I think are the correct elements of policy. Then there is the discussion of the 18 months, which I think is probably an error, and it is possibly a grave error. But I think it's also important to go back and say, what has the administration said? When you listen to Secretary Clinton, Secretary Gates, Admiral Mullen, General McChrystal, Rodriguez, Eikenberry, you have an absolute consistency that what happens in 18 months is the beginning of a process which could be very slow and very small, and which is condition-based. That in itself is not the everybody out of the pool in 18 months. It is not we're going up now and we're about to start what has been called a steep ramp down. There is nothing in the description of the policy which says we're ramping down steeply. However, when the president has talked about it, he has emphasized the 18-month period and none of the conditionality, or very little of it, which he has left almost entirely to his cabinet to defend, which means that he is explaining one policy to the nation and he is letting the gloss of that policy be carried by a group who, however competent, speak essentially inside the Beltway. That, I think, is a mistake, and part of the mistake, I think, is exactly that which Ahmed Rashid described yesterday evening, that it is profoundly mistaken in the region, and therefore it cuts absolutely against what we are trying to do. Because if we're really leaving in 18 months, and that plays into an Afghan and a Pakistani memory of past, then they know that the other things in the policy can't be achieved in 18 months, and therefore people begin to hedge their bets and look for their way out. It also raises a question about what is the president's commitment. Is he really committed to the policy which he has announced in more detail and which his entire cabinet is explaining? And is this therefore simply a defense against the left wing of the Democratic Party? Or does it indicate a lack of firmness on the part of the commander-in-chief? That is an important element, and I can't answer that question. I do think that it is not, well, let me just put it this way. I do think he has somewhat more time than I think we popularly tend to assume. There is a sort of, how long can you keep this up, and does not that therefore mean that you should bolt instantly? I don't know why preemptive capitulation looks so much better when it's not given as a strategy by diplomats. In fact, I would argue that the break point is 2012, not 2010. It's not 18 months. President Bush, with a popularity rating that I think was then about 17%, was able to maintain and sustain a surge in Iraq. And he certainly was not as eloquent a speaker as President Obama. I believe, therefore, that strong presidential leadership could sustain this, whether right or wrong. He has the capability to sustain it longer than people think. I also do not think the 2010 by-election in America is going to be nearly as catastrophic an event for Afghan policy as many are assuming. I mean, think this through. How many actual Democrats are going to run against both their Republican opponent and the president in the same election when the president's of their own party? There will be some limited districts in which the anti-war sentiment is strong enough to make that a winning strategy. But a Democrat who is defending against a surge of unhappiness with the economy and with jobs is not likely to add the opposition to the Afghan war as a key element. So I think this is greatly overstated in 2010. By 2012, it may be and that'll be a presidential election, larger national issues, economy might even be better. That's going to be a very different election, but not 2010. So I think, therefore, there is time, and I think now the attention has to move from this sort of circular debate we've been having about policy, because right or wrong, we have a policy, to a little more examination of what is going to make that policy work. Now, one key element of that is the building of the Afghan army. Let me use that as an example of what I mean when I say it is now about execution and not about policy. We can do what we've been doing, under-resource the trainers. Biggest issue I had when I left Afghanistan was that we were then 3,500 civilian and military trainers short for the police and the military, And at the beginning of the Obama administration, we sent 4,000 more trainers, most of whom were the same 3,500. So we can continue to under-resource training, short focus equipment, try to push units out through the training cycle too fast, commit them to battle before they're really ready, grind them up, and find we have very poor performance. Or we can have enough trainers, we can have them really embedded with the troops, we can have them lead, we can fund and resource, and we have to pay some political attention to the promotion, and we can have a pretty good result. But it's all about execution, it's not about the policy. There is a discussion about, can you do this with a largely illiterate army, you know, like Alexander's. I find this debate a little strange. It is true that this is a more technological age, but after all, these are the same fellows that fought against the Soviets, that are fighting with the Taliban, that are making our life difficult. If there's anything they can do reasonably well, it's fight. Train, organize, discipline, those are all real issues, but they're issues of execution. The civilian government is going to be the toughest nut to crack. On a national level, dealing with the cabinet, I just want to observe that there are actually some pretty good ministers. There are some others who are real dogs. But a collection of the ministers now are probably the strongest cabinet, that is, that part of the cabinet which exists, is in many ways the strongest cabinet that I think President Karzai has had since the beginning of his government. Agriculture, finance, interior, defense, education, possibly mines. These are all pretty good ministers. They're still short-staffed, but they're much better than they were. Information, I was very pleased to see the return of the former Minister of Information who did so much, Information and Culture, who did so much to open up the media climate of Afghanistan. Given some of the comments earlier today about how beleaguered, and it's true, the Afghan media has become, I think that step is very important. Now that's the national level of a government that is still much too centralized for what it is capable of discharging. But we can reinforce those ministries. That is not a panacea or a guarantee. It is simply that there is a place to work. It is not hopeless. The provinces are much more complicated and a lot more complicated than I'm going to do this afternoon. But there is an effort going on to try to work sort of from the bottom up. And here again, there are massive areas of execution. The policy itself is one that is causing tension in Afghanistan between our civilian and military leadership. That tension is not particularly healthy, and the fact that it is known is less healthy. But one has certain sort of litmus tests which we have to apply rather than arguing in a cookie-cutter fashion that it is good or bad to work at a lower level. If one is empowering groups and not individuals, if one is creating a relationship between those groups and government authority, then you have a chance that this is a more positive outcome. If we end up simply resourcing and reinvigorating commanders whose primary claim to fame since the fall of the Soviets has been their ability to fight with each other, then we are building on sand and we are creating nothing, whether or not we get a security payout from that in the short run. But again, it will be the implementation, the care with which we discharge the policy, not the policy itself, which is largely going to determine success or failure. Obviously, President Karzai is a key piece of this, and I have a little more sympathy for him than perhaps others do. He is not the strongest leader we've ever had. On the other hand, he has a very weak hand to play, does not control much force nor much money. And he's the man we've got. We do have one clear lesson from the past. Every time we've tried to make changes unilaterally in the middle of wars with other people's governments, we've gotten it wrong. think that's kind of fair claim from Diem to Chalabi, and we ought not to go that route. So that tells you a couple of things. I would say it is true that right now he has very little legitimacy, but I would also say that legitimacy in the Afghan context can be earned through performance and security. We may not get those, but it is perfectly possible to earn them. It is not fundamentally flawed by an election, which many Afghans find a kind of strange concept, which was hugely fraudulent, no question about that. On the other hand, when you discount for all the fraud, what the International Commission left Karzai with was less than their 50%. Required to avoid a runoff was about 47%. I simply note in passing that Bill Clinton won his first election with 43%, when the field was only split with 3 candidates. So while there is a great deal of fraud and the outcome is a limitation of legitimacy, it is probably more limited by having Karzai accept the runoff flanked by Senator Kerry and the American ambassador than by the fact of fraud in the first round, because it makes him look like a puppet. We have handled President Karzai very badly. I mean, the man is what he is, and I rather like him, I will admit, but he is not always wrong about how much change Afghanistan can accept. I think the polls analytically are fairly clear. On the one end, if you get no reform, no change, we lose. On the other end, if you push too much change too fast, exactly as Whitney described earlier, you lose. And so everything else is an art and a balance in the middle of the continuum. And that is a discussion one has to have with President Karzai and others repeatedly about how far you push to change and what you don't change, or at what pace. But that discussion has become hugely clouded by a very broad perception in Kabul of the Americans being against Karzai. And that now puts a lens in front of the balancing act in which everything that we want to do, or many of them, is being analyzed through a view of whether or not this or that change is part of a conspiracy to undercut him. That is not a useful situation. The tension and the suspicion which exists now needs to be brought down. We need to diminish the decibels. I've been married a long time, but I've never won an argument with my wife by yelling at her. I don't know why we think that profound public expression of irritation does better with foreign leaders across cultures. So we need to get back to a position in which we have a fundamental agreement and understanding that we are in this fight together to win. And within that, we are going to talk about differences on ministries, people, on what one is accomplishing, but we need to reestablish a common basis of trust, which is now profoundly lacking. Now, we have heard a good deal about reconciliation and negotiation, and let me say that I fully accept the idea that the outcome, the best outcome, might well be a political solution. I agree with Ahmed, but I do not think we have any chance whatsoever of getting to such an acceptable solution quickly. And in fact, when we talk about 18 months and we're leaving, why in the world would anybody negotiate anything painful with us if they can have it all in 18 months? So we're doing ourselves considerable disservice. We are going to have to do some nasty hard fighting. We are going to have to change what the Soviets used to call in their charming fashion the objective correlation of forces. And we are going to have to internalize in Americans that negotiation and force are not alternatives. They are tools. I think it was the late Prime Minister Rabin who had, at least I think it was his, but I haven't looked it up because it only occurred to me yesterday, I think had one of the best expressions of this. He said, I have to negotiate as though there were no war and to fight as though there were no negotiation. We have a profound problem this time in understanding that. There is a desire to find negotiations as a shortcut out of the war. That is disastrous. That simply says, we're giving up, give me the best deal you can before I run for the hills. And this is not a culture that respects that sort of plaintive weakness. So I think that negotiations may well be the long-term aim. To the extent that we and President Karzai are somewhat out of sync, as was discussed earlier, that is, I think, also part of his political survival technique. And after all, he's a pretty good politician, even if governance is not a strong point. He outmaneuvered us, and he outmaneuvered his opponents in the election. And however distasteful some of his tactics, I think one also ought to have some respect for political acumen. Nor do I think that he is likely to commit suicide by the final terms of a negotiation. So we have, I think, a situation so serious that it is worth fighting for. We have possibilities, but no certainty. We have some more time than I think the most dolorous view takes, but not a lot of time. This year, I think, cannot be the end game, as my friend Ahmed said last night, unless it is the end game of our defeat. We simply cannot accomplish enough in 1 year for this year to be the end game. It may be, to borrow a phrase from a much more distinguished speaker, it may be the end of the beginning. We are now resourcing and doing things which we should have been doing years ago, but we need to do them with an awareness of realistic timelines. I find very little discussion of that. If you have a big economic budget, we did this in 2005, or 6, we finally made a decision, fall of 2006, the budget goes to Congress in February of 2007, voted on in the summer, money available in the fall after you figure out what the Congress actually did with the vote. By that time, you can sign contracts legally. You can do a little demining for a road so your engineers don't blow up. And then it's winter. The first time dirt turns and an Afghan can see something happening on the road that you decided to build in 2006 is the spring of 2008. That is a lag which is built into our constitutional system. It's not one of one administration's malfeasance or another. That is true of building armies, where you have to do a lot of things. There are time lags. If we build too radical an expectation in ourselves and in others for what can be done in 18 months, then I think we simply create the seeds of the depression and the disillusionment which follows. We need a much more realistic description of what can be done, but I think a good deal can be. And that is why I think that this year can be the end of the beginning, and very much a new beginning. But we will be left with huge challenges. We do have some positive things to work with. Parliament, for all its corruption and problems, is far better to work with and more responsible than the Iraqi parliament, in which I had some dealings. Taliban are not well liked. Afghans want peace. There is still, despite the decline, which was quite correctly shown on the chart, there is still a substantial support for us. There is a doubt that we know what we're doing. That's different. So I would simply say this is too serious to capitulate prematurely. It is possible that we can have a great deal more success, but it is going to be a year, certainly, of considerable blood and considerable sacrifice. I do not argue that the results are certain, but I think the difference now between success and failure, other than a loss of will on our part, is going to be far more in our sensitivity of execution of policy than in the policy itself. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah.